She thought she could scare me with her badge-wearing wannabes and clipboard of petty rules. But when her fake cops tried to bluff their way past my gate, they had no idea the real chief of police was already sipping coffee in my living room. Smash that like button and subscribe for more insane real-life HOA showdowns that'll leave you speechless. It started the day I moved in. The weather was perfect, the sky a radiant blue without a cloud in sight, and the moving truck had just pulled into the driveway of what I had hoped would be my dream home. After years of saving, planning, and searching, I had finally found a place that offered both tranquility and a touch of luxury. A quiet cul-de-sac with manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and picturesque homes tucked behind the gates of what the real estate brochure called an exclusive community driven by pride and harmony. It seemed ideal. The gatehouse security had been polite enough. I gave them my move-in pass and was allowed through without much trouble. Neighbors waved as I passed by, their smiles wide but unreadable. Some just stood in their driveways, arms crossed, watching the truck like it might roll through and ruin the aesthetic balance of their serene little enclave. I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they were just bored. The suburbs can be like that. The house itself was incredible. A little bigger than I probably needed, but I wasn't just buying square footage, I was buying peace of mind. That's what I told myself. The backyard opened into a wooded preserve. No one behind me for acres. A large front porch and an oversized garage gave me the feeling I had finally arrived. And after years of noisy apartments, indifferent landlords, and waking up to the sounds of sirens, I was ready for silence, for routine, for safety. That was the promise of this place. I'd barely been inside for an hour when the first visitor arrived. I heard a firm, rhythmic knock on the door and opened it to find a woman in her late 50s standing with a clipboard and a tight-lipped smile. Her posture was stiff, as if her spine had never bent once in its entire life. Her blonde bob was almost too perfect, the kind of hair that looks like it gets its own appointment separate from the rest of the body. She wore a pressed blouse tucked neatly into khakis, and her name badge read, Karen, HOA President. She introduced herself briskly, not bothering to ask for my name. I offered it anyway, along with a handshake, which she only acknowledged with a glance. She went straight into a rehearsed welcome speech about the standards and values of our community, and how each homeowner plays a role in preserving our shared lifestyle. It wasn't what she said that struck me. It was how she said it. Like she was reminding me that I had signed a contract to conform. Like this wasn't my home, it was her jurisdiction. She handed me a thick packet of HOA guidelines and began highlighting pages she thought I should read immediately. Lawn maintenance standards, garbage bin storage rules, holiday decoration dates and limits. I tried to stay polite, nodding along as I took the papers. She paused before leaving and let her eyes drift to the moving truck still half full. Then, in a tone that felt more like a command than a courtesy, she reminded me that move-ins were only permitted during designated weekday hours. It was Saturday. Apparently, I had already violated rule number 1. I apologized, caught off guard. My real estate agent had never mentioned anything about specific moving times. Karen simply raised her eyebrows and muttered that it would be noted. She turned without another word and walked back to her house, which I soon discovered was directly across the street from mine. Great. My first and closest neighbor was also the self-appointed warden of the neighborhood. By Monday morning, I had already received my first warning. Notice an official-looking letter slipped under my door, stating that the moving truck had remained on the property longer than HOA regulations allowed. A second note was attached about visible boxes in the garage, which, I kid you not, were labeled as unsightly. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was a boot camp for aesthetics. Over the next few weeks, I tried to adapt. I painted my mailbox to match the mandated eggshell tone. I measured my grass down to the 1/4 inch. I installed blinds in the garage windows because someone had cited garage interior visibility as a problem. And every time a car was parked slightly off-center on a driveway, or a basketball hoop appeared within sight of the street, a new round of violations circulated. Not just for me, but for everyone. Despite my efforts to comply, Karen always found something. She seemed to watch from her front window like a hawk, eyes scanning for deviations. I once received a notice for leaving my recycling bin out 40 minutes past collection time. Another for leaving my porch light on past 11 p.m. That one confused me. Who writes up a porch light? What unnerved me more than the constant notices was how comfortable she was showing up in person. She would ring the bell and stand on my doorstep, as if it were an extension of her own home. Her tone was always flat, her comments framed as reminders, but they carried the weight of threats. "Just making sure you're aware of what's expected," she'd say, smiling tightly. It felt less like neighborly concern, and more like the opening moves of a chess match. I tried talking to some other residents, hoping for advice or solidarity. Most of them gave vague smiles and carefully neutral comments. A few told me, in quiet tones, that they had stopped fighting the HOA years ago. One man leaned in and said, "She's not just the president, she is the HOA." I learned that Karen had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had served as president for 15 of them. She had rewritten bylaws, stacked the board with friends, and filed so many citations over the years that one resident joked she probably had her own printer just for the violation slips. The more I learned, the more it became clear that Karen enjoyed the power. It wasn't just about keeping things orderly, it was about control. She operated like a mini dictator with a garden rake in one hand and a statute book in the other, and the HOA, which should have been a group effort, had turned into a one-woman regime. I started to feel like I was being watched, not in the paranoid sense, but in the real, tangible way of always catching a glimpse of Karen walking her dog suspiciously close to my yard, or seeing her silhouette in her window whenever I opened my front door. One afternoon, she actually measured the distance from my trash bins to the curb using a retractable tape. When I asked her what she was doing, she simply said, "Verifying compliance." Something had to give. I wasn't about to spend my life under the thumb of a woman whose idea of community was fear wrapped in HOA letterhead. I hadn't fought tooth and nail to buy this home just to be bullied into submission by someone with a clipboard. I started thinking seriously about what it would take to change the dynamic. Not just for me, but for everyone else too afraid to stand up to her. I had no idea at the time how far she would go to keep her power, but I was already beginning to sense that this was no ordinary neighborhood conflict. Karen wasn't just difficult, she was dangerous. It was a Tuesday morning when Karen showed up again. I remember because I had just made coffee and stepped out onto the front porch, hoping to enjoy a few quiet minutes before logging into work. The sky was overcast, a welcome change from the relentless sun, and for a brief moment, everything felt calm. That calm vanished the second I saw her marching up my walkway with that same clipboard clutched to her chest like it held the secrets to the universe. She didn't bother to knock this time. I was already standing there, mug in hand, and she met my eyes with a look that suggested this conversation was already overdue. There was no pleasantry, no good morning, not even a cursory smile to pretend civility. She opened her mouth and began speaking in that measured, unblinking tone she seemed to reserve for people she had decided were beneath her. According to Karen, a complaint had been filed. Several, in fact. She listed them off one by one with the precision of someone reading court charges. My trash bins, apparently, had been visible from the street for 35 minutes longer than allowed after pickup. A neighbor had claimed that my lawn edging was not consistent with the HOA's preferred border style. And then there was the paint on my shutters. The catalog said soft taupe. Karen said they looked brashly beige in certain lighting. That last part almost made me laugh out loud. She handed me a sheet with the complaints typed in bullet points, each one with a code next to it from the HOA guidelines. At the bottom was a space labeled, "Acknowledged by resident," with a signature line. I didn't touch it. I told her calmly that I hadn't received any formal warnings about these alleged issues, and if complaints had been made, I'd like to know who made them. She responded with a rehearsed line about confidentiality and community trust. I pointed out that without transparency, trust was meaningless. She stared at me for a moment, eyes narrowing, and then asked if I was planning to be cooperative moving forward. It was not a question. I stood there for a few seconds, then took a slow sip from my coffee. The mug said, "This is my happy place," which now felt a little ironic. I told her I would need to review the bylaws myself and, if necessary, consult with my attorney. That word, attorney, seemed to register. A faint flicker of tension crossed her face, just for a moment, before she composed herself again. Karen took a step closer. She was now standing well within my personal space, close enough that I could smell her perfume, which was a sharp, citrusy scent that reminded me of hotel lobbies. She lowered her voice and said something I have never forgotten. I just want to remind you that the HOA has enforcement authority, and in cases of continued non-compliance, we're not above involving external enforcement. I asked her what that meant. She smiled without warmth and said, "Some homeowners respond better when there are uniforms involved." I didn't say anything. I just stared at her. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. I don't know if she expected me to cower or offer some panicked promise to repaint my shutters and hide my bins in the basement, but I gave her nothing. She stood there another few seconds, then turned on her heel and walked away, the clipboard tucked back under her arm like a weapon holstered after a skirmish. That afternoon, I made a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Chief Nolan, a longtime friend of my father's and the current chief of police in our town, answered on the third ring. I told him I'd recently moved into a community with a very aggressive HOA, and that someone had just implied they might call in external enforcement. He asked a few questions, mostly clarifying whether they meant city code enforcement or actual law enforcement. I told him I didn't know, but I was getting the distinct impression that they liked to blur that line. He sighed and told me this wasn't the first time he'd heard something like this. Apparently, HOAs with overzealous leadership sometimes used vague threats of calling in authorities as a means of intimidation, hoping residents didn't know the limits of HOA power. Nolan offered to come by sometime that week for a casual visit. I could tell it was more than just a friendly drop-in. He was curious. In the meantime, I did my homework. I sat down that night with the massive HOA binder Karen had given me and began reading it line by line. It was tedious, filled with legal jargon and redundant phrasing, but I pushed through. What I found was both predictable and maddening. The HOA could issue fines and citations for non-compliance with architectural standards and general rules of conduct, but they had no authority to enforce criminal law, issue summonses, or bring in law enforcement unless a crime had actually been committed. And in no place did it mention anything about HOA personnel directly engaging with or overseeing law enforcement response. Karen's little warning was a bluff, an elaborate, threatening bluff. 2 days later, I caught her taking photos of my backyard from the walking trail that bordered the woods. She wasn't on my property technically, but she was leaning slightly through the shrub line, angling her phone as if trying to catch something incriminating. I walked out and said her name loud enough for her to hear. She froze for a beat, then turned and walked off without a word, not even a fake smile this time. The following morning, a note was taped to my door. It was neatly folded and unsigned. It said, "You're making a mistake challenging the board. We are watching." That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an annoyance and started seeing it for what it was, a coordinated attempt to intimidate me into submission. Later that evening, Nolan came by. We sat in my kitchen drinking coffee while I showed him the notes, the violations, and some of the recorded encounters from my doorbell camera. He shook his head slowly, muttering that this woman was a wannabe sheriff in a sundress. His words, not mine. He confirmed that impersonating law enforcement, even in casual appearance, was a serious offense. He suggested that if I noticed anything suspicious, anyone claiming to be enforcement without proper credentials, I should notify the police immediately. Then he leaned back, smiled, and said, "Or better yet, call me directly." That gave me an idea. A bold, maybe slightly reckless idea. But it was clear Karen was escalating, and if she was going to bluff about involving enforcement, maybe it was time she saw what real authority looked like. Not the kind carried on a clipboard, but the kind carried in a badge that actually meant something. And so the trap began to take shape. I didn't know exactly how or when Karen would make her next move, but I knew she would. People like her don't back down when they think they're winning. They double down. They escalate. I just had to be ready when she did. The plan didn't come to me all at once. It unfolded in fragments over several restless nights and long walks through the back trails of the neighborhood, where I could think without feeling the invisible pressure of Karen's watchful windows. The more I considered it, the clearer it became. I had to stop reacting and start moving ahead of her. Karen thrived on control, on catching people off guard, on forcing them to scramble and comply. I had no intention of letting her keep that power, not over me, and not over anyone else. The first thing I did was reach out to my lawyer, Allison. We had worked together before on some contracts when I was freelancing, And while she wasn't a specialist in HOA law, she knew enough about property disputes and municipal code to steer me in the right direction. After a lengthy phone call and a few days of document exchanges, she confirmed what I had already suspected. Most of the citations Karen had issued were legally meaningless. They were meant to intimidate. The HOA could fine me, sure, but only through a formal process, which required board votes, notice periods, and opportunities to appeal. None of that had happened. More troubling, however, was the issue of impersonation. I told Alison about the veiled threat Karen had made, about her hinting that uniforms could be brought in. That, Alison said, was murky ground. The HOA could hire private security, but those individuals had to be clearly identified as such. If they so much as implied they were official law enforcement, they would be breaking the law. Alison's advice was simple. Document everything. Record all interactions. And if I had reason to believe anyone was pretending to be an officer, notify the police immediately. So I did just that. I began documenting everything. I installed a new set of security cameras, ones with better angles and higher resolution. I kept a log of every notice, every visit, every encounter. I took screenshots of Karen walking around with her clipboard like she was conducting a military inspection. I even began recording audio on my phone during casual neighborhood strolls, just in case a conversation turned ugly. I wasn't interested in catching her in some grand criminal act. I just wanted a record of the truth. Then I reached out to Nolan again, the police chief, and invited him over for dinner. I told him I wanted to talk more about HOA enforcement limits and the impersonation laws. He agreed without hesitation. When he showed up that Friday evening, he wore a casual button-down and jeans, but he still carried the air of authority that comes with decades in law enforcement. I could tell from the way he stood, the way he scanned the street with a glance, that this was more than a social call for him. He was curious, maybe even concerned. We sat out back near the fire pit, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the lawn. I poured us both a drink, and then brought out the file I had compiled. Photos, letters, printed emails from the HOA, and transcripts of every conversation I could remember. Nolan read through them slowly, his expression unreadable. Occasionally, he would grunt or raise an eyebrow, but mostly he stayed quiet. When he finished, he placed the folder on the table and said one word. Pattern. I asked him what he meant. She's testing boundaries, he said. You're new, and she sees you as a threat to her order. The citations are just bait. The goal isn't compliance, it's submission. But if she starts escalating and bringing in people pretending to be law enforcement, that's not just HOA nonsense anymore. That's criminal impersonation. And I can do something about that. He explained that impersonating a police officer, even loosely, was a serious offense. It didn't matter if someone wore a uniform that looked official or used language that implied authority. If they acted in a way that led a reasonable person to believe they were a cop, it was illegal. And if Karen was recruiting people to do just that, she was walking a very thin line. We agreed on a strategy. I would keep doing exactly what I was doing, acting normal, not pushing back too hard, not letting on that I was preparing anything. Nolan said if Karen escalated, if she brought someone to my door claiming any kind of official authority, I should call him directly. He would come in person. No sirens, no squad cars, just him. Calm, composed, unmistakably real. He would let them dig their own hole. After he left, I sat by the fire for a long time. The night air had turned cool, and the stars were just beginning to show through the trees. It felt strange, plotting a confrontation like this. I wasn't used to thinking in terms of traps and counter moves, but the more I learned about Karen, the more convinced I became that she wouldn't stop on her own. She had built her little empire over years of subtle manipulation and unchecked authority. She counted on people giving in, on their unwillingness to challenge her. Over the next week, I noticed a few strange things. A white SUV with no license plate in the front began parking on the street near the corner, staying for long periods and then disappearing. A man in a dark blue jacket walked past my house 3 times in one day, each time glancing at my cameras before quickly turning away. And Karen, usually content to pace her own yard like a sentry, had taken to walking further down the street, peering into driveways and pretending to pick up stray pieces of trash from the sidewalk. I started getting new notices. This time, they were anonymous. slipped into my mailbox without stamps or return addresses. They were typed, with no header, no signature. One accused me of violating community noise regulations, even though I had no music or parties. Another cited excessive nighttime lighting, which I assumed referred to the motion sensors I had installed. These weren't just warnings, they were provocations. I held on to everything. Then came the conversation with Mr. Rivera, an older gentleman who lived 2 doors down. He stopped me one afternoon while I was trimming hedges and asked how I was settling in. We chatted for a while, and then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that Karen had once accused his grandson of vandalism without proof. She had told him that she had friends in enforcement who could make life difficult if the family didn't cooperate. The grandson was 12. That was when Rivera started keeping his curtains closed. I asked him if he'd be willing to speak up if things escalated. He hesitated. Then he said yes, but only if others came forward too. That, to me, was the most telling sign of all. People were afraid of her, not because of anything she could legally do, but because of the atmosphere she created, one where resistance came with consequences, and silence was safer. It was becoming clearer that the moment of escalation was approaching. Karen was too invested, too practiced, to let me slide into the neighborhood without submitting to her authority. She saw resistance as infection, something that had to be crushed before it spread. I had no doubt she was preparing something bigger, something more theatrical. I wasn't sure what it would look like, but I knew how it would end, because this time she wouldn't be the only one staging a performance. And when her curtain lifted, she'd find a different audience than she expected, one that had a badge, one that carried real authority. And I would be watching it all from the front row. It was the quiet before the storm. Those who've dealt with a bully long enough know that eerie stillness before the next lunge. Karen had been unusually silent for 5 days. No surprise visits, no new notices, not even a passive-aggressive glance from across the street. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. It felt staged, like she had withdrawn not to retreat, but to reload. I used that time wisely. Every morning, I walked the perimeter of my property, not to check for HOA violations, but to inspect the new surveillance setup. 4 cameras now covered the front gate, the driveway, the porch, and the side path that led to the backyard. All of them were discreet, hardwired, and backed up remotely. A 5th camera, temporarily placed in an upper window, gave me a wide-angle view of the street. Each evening, I reviewed the footage. Nothing major had occurred yet, but the lingering SUV had returned several times, always idling just out of clear view, and always during odd hours. It had tinted windows and no front license plate, the same car I had noticed earlier. Inside the house, I upgraded my intercom and gate buzzer system. The gate was already secure, but I added a speaker that connected to my phone, allowing me to answer without being seen or heard from inside. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Karen had hinted at external enforcement. If she tried to send someone to my door claiming authority, I wanted full control of the conversation. No surprises. In between these tasks, I began quietly speaking to more neighbors. Not everyone wanted to talk, and a few quickly deflected the moment Karen's name came up. But others, like the Riveras, opened up with stories that echoed my own. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Tara, told me that Karen once issued a warning for hanging wind chimes that were too tonal. Another recounted being threatened with fines after his kids chalked butterflies on the sidewalk during spring break. Karen's pattern was clear. She wasn't keeping order. She was manufacturing violations, leveraging them to maintain a grip on the community. One evening I found myself talking with Nolan again. We kept things low-key. He didn't show up in uniform, just jeans and a plain jacket, blending in like any other suburban neighbor. We sat on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the treetops, and I updated him on the SUV, the new notices, and the sudden quiet. He listened carefully, nodding, occasionally jotting something in a small notepad he carried in his back pocket. He said the impersonation law was rarely used, but it existed for a reason. People pretending to be cops was a serious matter, not just because it was illegal, but because it eroded public trust. If Karen or anyone she worked with showed up and implied authority they didn't have, Nolan could intervene, and the consequences would be very real. I asked him if it would be helpful if he was present, discreetly, should anything go down. He smiled and said he was already thinking the same thing. So we made a plan. Nothing flashy, no coordinated sting or marked patrol car, just a casual evening visit. If Karen showed up, she'd walk right into it. If she didn't, we would at least enjoy a quiet dinner and discuss options moving forward. Nolan even joked about bringing dessert, which seemed wildly out of place given the tension in the air, but it helped. Humor has a strange way of taking the sharp edge off dread. I chose the following Friday for the dinner. It gave me a few more days to prepare, and it happened to line up with the HOA's monthly inspection cycle. Karen's clipboard always seemed busiest around those times. I spent the week as normal, kept the lawn trimmed, bins hidden, porch tidy. I wanted to make it impossible for her to cite anything obvious. If she wanted a confrontation, she'd have to manufacture it out of thin air. Thursday evening, the SUV circled twice. I captured it on video, clearer this time. A white Tahoe with no front plate, and a small magnetized logo on the driver's door. The image was blurry, but I could make out the words, Community Integrity Services. A quick online search showed no official registration. The website linked to a dead page, and the business listing had no physical address. That was when I knew for sure Karen wasn't bluffing. She had either hired or invented a group designed to look official. The uniforms, the logo, the vague title. It was all meant to create an illusion of power. Friday arrived quietly. The morning was bright and breezy, the kind of day people usually spend gardening or walking their dogs, but the street felt unusually still. Karen's car wasn't in her driveway, and her curtains were drawn, which was rare. I had the creeping sensation that I was being watched, but when I checked the cameras, nothing seemed unusual. Still, I double-checked the gates and made sure everything on my property was in compliance. Nolan arrived just after 6. He wore his badge on a chain tucked under his collar, barely visible, and carried no weapon. This wasn't about intimidation, just presence. We ate dinner in the kitchen and kept the blinds open, allowing a clear view of the front walkway. Just two neighbors catching up over a meal. No reason for concern. At least, not yet. By 7, the sun had started to drop, casting long shadows across the front lawn. That was when I heard the gate buzzer. 3 sharp rings. Not the hesitant kind you get from delivery drivers or friends. These were deliberate, insistent. I looked at the monitor and saw 2 men standing just outside the gate. Both wore dark blue polo shirts with matching pants, and each had a clipped badge hanging from their chest. Behind them stood the white Tahoe, idling, driver still behind the wheel. Karen was nowhere in sight. I pressed the intercom. The taller of the 2 stepped forward and announced that they were with Community Enforcement Response and were conducting a compliance verification visit. His tone was confident, but rehearsed. The way someone speaks when they've been told what to say but don't fully understand what it means. I asked who authorized the visit. He replied that the HOA board had issued a directive based on escalating violations, and that they had been asked to verify certain aspects of my property. When I asked for credentials, he held up the badge, but it was hard to read. It looked like a plastic laminate, something you'd find at a security expo. I told him that property inspections must be scheduled in writing, and that unless they had legal authority, they were trespassing. At that moment, Nolan stepped beside me and glanced at the monitor. His expression didn't change, but his voice did. He told me to let him handle it. We both stepped out through the front door and approached the gate slowly. Nolan didn't speak at first. He just stood beside me, while I addressed the 2 men again. I asked once more who they were with. The taller man started repeating his earlier line, but Nolan interrupted. He stepped forward, pulled his badge from under his collar, and held it up with one hand. Chief Nolan, City Police. I'd like to see your identification and licensing documents. The silence was immediate. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, then glanced back at the SUV. The driver was already pulling away. The taller man stammered something about being contractors. Nolan didn't blink. Contractors for who? And under what authority are you performing property checks? If you claim to represent law enforcement in any way, we're going to have a very different conversation. The taller man said nothing. The shorter one mumbled that they were just doing what they were told. Nolan asked again for identification. This time, they handed over flimsy laminated cards that listed no licensing number, no agency affiliation, and no official insignia. It was over right then. Nolan told them they were being detained for questioning. He called for a patrol unit, calm and measured, like this was routine. The two men didn't resist. They didn't have the nerve. They stood there quietly, waiting, knowing they had pushed their luck too far. From across the street, a curtain twitched. Karen's silhouette lingered for a few seconds, then disappeared. And just like that, the game had changed. The air was still thick with tension when the two men were escorted to the patrol car. They didn't put up a fight. In fact, once they realized they were dealing with a real police officer who was not about to be fooled by a badge printed on glossy paper, they seemed to shrink into themselves. The taller one kept glancing at the gate, as though hoping for someone to come walking down the street and rescue him from the situation. But no one came. The SUV had vanished down the road the second Nolan identified himself, and whoever had been driving clearly had no intention of returning. I watched as the officers from the responding unit arrived, quietly professional, taking notes and asking calm questions. They photographed the fake credentials, examined the uniforms, and took statements. The two men offered little explanation. They said they were hired to perform routine security checks on behalf of the HOA. When pressed, they admitted they had received written instructions from someone but refused to say who. It was obvious to everyone standing there that the orders came from Karen, though her name had not yet been spoken. Nolan stayed at my side, offering a quiet presence that kept the scene grounded. He asked me once more to describe exactly how they had introduced themselves at the gate. I repeated the interaction word for word. When I got to the part about community enforcement response, he shook his head slightly. That term alone was enough. It had been crafted to sound official, to suggest a connection to actual law enforcement. In the eyes of the law, that mattered. It wasn't just misleading, it was deliberate impersonation. Karen's curtain did not twitch again. Her lights stayed off. Her driveway remained empty. But she had seen everything. She had watched the plan unfold, had seen her so-called enforcers exposed for what they were, and now she was hiding behind silence. It was almost theatrical in its cowardice. Once the patrol car pulled away with the two men in custody, Nolan and I returned inside. We sat back at the kitchen table, the same spot where we had eaten dinner just an hour earlier, and let the silence settle. There was nothing celebratory about what had just happened. No high fives, no gloating, just the cold satisfaction of truth coming to light. Nolan told me that the impersonators could be charged, depending on what else the investigation uncovered. If they had conducted similar checks at other homes, if they had pretended to have authority beyond what was legal, if they had issued any kind of orders or threats, then it would all be part of the case. He also said he would be speaking to the HOA directly, not as a police chief, but as a concerned resident advocate. There was no guarantee Karen would be immediately removed from her position, but this incident would not be easy for her to brush aside. Before Nolan left, he turned to me and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Are you planning to stay here long term?" I wasn't sure how to answer. This house had been my goal for years. The escape, the new beginning, the peace. And yet here I was, in the middle of a drama I never asked for. I told him the truth. That I didn't know yet. That I wanted to. But I needed to see what happened next. He nodded and said, "If more people like you stay, it gets better. People like her count on silence." The next morning, the street was unnaturally quiet. A few neighbors walked their dogs at odd hours, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Cars crept out of driveways, their drivers glancing up toward my house with cautious curiosity. The white Tahoe never returned. And Karen's driveway stayed empty until almost noon, when her silver sedan appeared suddenly, like it had dropped from the sky. She got out, head held high, and walked inside without looking in my direction. But the silence didn't last. By the afternoon, word had begun to spread. Not because I said anything, but because news like that never stays hidden for long. Someone had seen the patrol cars. Someone else had heard the gate buzzer conversation through a cracked window. Within hours, the HOA message board was buzzing, first with confused speculation, then with more pointed questions. Someone asked why 2 fake cops were escorted off the property. Another wanted to know who authorized them. A third asked if anyone else had received compliance visits. Karen remained silent. No public statements, no posts, no explanations. The very next day, a letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox. It was printed on official letterhead and signed by Karen herself, though I recognized the writing as carefully filtered legal language. The letter explained that a contracted security service had been hired to assist with routine compliance observations. It claimed that any confusion regarding their authority was regrettable and that the board would review procedures to prevent future misunderstandings. Not once did it acknowledge that impersonation had occurred. Not once did it admit that laws had been broken. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. People had seen it with their own eyes. The illusion had shattered. Karen's authority had rested on perception. The idea that she was backed by invisible power, by enforcement, by rules no one dared question. Now the image had cracked wide open, and beneath it was just a woman with a clipboard, pretending to be something more. That weekend I took a walk through the neighborhood. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't being watched. A few neighbors nodded as I passed. One man, who had never spoken to me before, raised a coffee mug in quiet salute. I stopped by the trail behind my house and stood where Karen had once leaned in to take photos of my yard. Now the space felt different. No longer a line of battle, just a wooded path again. I returned home and checked my cameras out of habit. Nothing suspicious. No unfamiliar cars. No figures in dark polo shirts. Just ordinary suburban movement. Kids biking. Sprinklers humming. A dog barking in the distance. Later that evening, Nolan called. He said the two men had been released pending further investigation, but both had admitted under questioning that they had been paid by someone on the HOA board. Neither used Karen's name directly, but both described a woman matching her appearance and role. It was enough to launch a formal inquiry. I asked him what would happen next. "That depends," he said. "If residents speak up, if the board starts asking real questions, then it might be time for a change. You've lit the fuse. Now let's see what burns." I thanked him, not just for his help, but for showing up, for being willing to stand quietly and wait behind the scenes until the moment counted. That kind of presence changes everything. When we ended the call, I looked out my window toward Karen's house. The lights were on, the shades were drawn. For the first time since I had moved in, I realized something that almost made me smile. She was the one hiding now, not me. By the time the weekend ended, the mood across the neighborhood had shifted in a way that was almost tangible. People were more alert, but also more talkative. The silence that Karen had cultivated for years, the quiet complicity that kept everyone in line, was starting to crack. I could hear it in the way neighbors now lingered on sidewalks just a little longer. Their conversations were cautious, but not cold. There was curiosity again. People wanted to know what had happened, and more importantly, what was coming next. Monday morning brought an unusual sight. Karen's car was still in her driveway, but her usual routine had changed. There was no early walk around the block, no inspection-style pacing near the front lawns, and no clipboard in hand. Her front blinds remained closed for most of the day, and when I passed by on my way to the mailbox, I caught a glimpse of her face through the window. She didn't look angry. She looked uncertain. Around noon, a patrol car made a slow drive through the neighborhood. No lights, no sirens, just a steady roll past the cul-de-sac. A few heads peeked out from behind windows. Some pretended not to notice, but I noticed, and I knew that patrol was no coincidence. Nolan had likely asked for a subtle show of presence, a reminder that real law enforcement was now paying attention to our little corner of the world. That evening, the HOA message board lit up again. This time, the posts were more direct. A resident named Michelle, who lived 3 doors down from me, asked whether the board had approved the hiring of the so-called security service. Her question was met with vague responses and a sudden post from Karen reminding everyone that the board operates within its legal rights and decisions are made in the best interest of the community. That line alone raised more questions. It was the kind of phrase you use when you have no good answer. By Tuesday, Nolan's prediction had started to come true. More residents were speaking out. One anonymous post claimed that the 2 men who had been detained had knocked on their door a few weeks earlier, asking to visually assess exterior compliance. Another said they saw Karen in her driveway giving envelopes to a man who matched the description of the taller impersonator. It was speculation, yes, but it carried weight. These were not accusations made in anger. These were memories resurfacing because the fear was beginning to lift. On Wednesday morning, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a copy of a meeting agenda for the upcoming HOA board session, scheduled for Friday evening in the community clubhouse. There was a note paper-clipped to the agenda. It was typed, unsigned, and read only, "She's trying to control the room. Come early." The agenda itself was innocuous at first glance. Standard bullet points about landscaping contracts and a proposed update to mailbox design standards. But buried in the middle was one that caught my eye: security procedures and compliance enforcement review. That was it. That was where it would happen. I called Nolan that afternoon and told him about the meeting. He said he would not attend in any official capacity unless called upon, but that he would remain close by if anything required his presence. I told him I did not expect another impersonation stunt. Karen had already played that card. What I did expect was something subtler: a speech, a deflection, a controlled narrative designed to make her look like the responsible leader who had simply made an honest mistake. I arrived at the clubhouse 20 minutes before the meeting started. A few other residents had already gathered outside, quietly chatting in small clusters. Michelle was there. So was Mr. Rivera and his daughter. A handful of others stood near the front entrance, watching the parking lot. Everyone seemed to be waiting for a signal, something to push them from observers into participants. I did not give a speech. I did not rally the crowd. But when someone asked what I thought was going to happen, I told them the truth. That Karen was going to try to salvage her authority, and that if no one spoke up, she might succeed. At 7 on the dot, the doors opened, and people began filing into the meeting room. Karen stood near the podium at the front, flanked by 2 other board members I did not recognize. They looked uncomfortable. I could see it in the way their eyes avoided the audience, and their posture lacked the confidence of leaders ready to speak. Karen, on the other hand, had clearly rehearsed. She began the meeting as she always did, or so I assumed, based on what others had told me. A short welcome, an overview of the agenda, and then a dive into each item. She sped through the first few points, barely pausing to take questions. Then came the topic we had all been waiting for. Regarding recent confusion surrounding enforcement activities, she said, the HOA had hired a third-party contractor to assist with visual compliance observations. She said the intent had never been to alarm anyone, and that the contractors were not meant to represent law enforcement. She referred to the incident at my house only as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked toward me more than once. She was watching my reactions. Then, without prompting, Michelle stood up. She asked if the board had voted to approve this security contractor. Karen paused for a split second before answering that under certain provisions, the president could authorize interim services in the interest of community safety. Michelle pressed again. Had the board voted yes or no? Karen replied that the matter was handled internally. That phrase caused a stir. People started whispering. Someone near the back said loud enough for the room to hear, "So, no vote?" Karen raised her voice slightly and said the board had been informed and that the details were in the meeting notes. That was when Mr. Rivera stood up. He said plainly that he had been approached by the same men weeks earlier and that they acted like they were official. He said they asked questions about his property, and when he refused, one of them warned that non-compliance reports would be filed. He looked straight at Karen when he said it. The room grew quiet. Karen tried to respond, but someone else stood up. Then another. People who had been silent for years were now telling stories of threats, vague warnings, citations that came out of nowhere. A woman said she had paid over $500 in fines for landscaping violations that were never documented. A man said his daughter had been afraid to ride her bike near Karen's house because she had been yelled at for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Karen's posture began to change. She was no longer confident. Her arms crossed in front of her chest, and her voice took on a defensive tone. She said people were twisting the facts, that the board had always acted with the community's best interest at heart. But the room was no longer hers. The voices grew stronger. What had once been a collection of isolated frustrations had become a unified front. Someone made a motion to schedule an emergency vote to evaluate leadership positions. It was seconded almost immediately. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming that proper procedure had not been followed, but the board members beside her did not back her up. One of them quietly said he supported the motion. The other looked like she wanted to disappear. By the end of the meeting, A date had been set for the vote. A temporary oversight committee would be formed to review past citations and contracts. Karen's power, once absolute, now hung by a thread. As I walked out of the clubhouse, I could feel it. The shift, the mood, the beginning of something new. Not just the collapse of a petty tyrant's control, but the return of a community that had spent too long under silence. Karen remained inside, surrounded by papers and unread expressions. The clipboard was still in her hands, but no one was listening anymore. The morning after the meeting felt different. The street was the same, the trees were the same, the birds chirped like they always did, but the feeling hanging in the air had changed. There was no longer that invisible weight, the one that pressed down on you as soon as you stepped out your front door. The neighbors who used to dart inside the moment they saw someone walking by now lingered at the curb. Conversations no longer came with glances over shoulders or hurried whispers. It felt, for the first time since I had moved in, like people were starting to live here again rather than just survive under rules. Karen did not come outside. Her house sat quiet, with its blinds drawn and front garden unkempt. Normally, her hedges were trimmed into rigid perfection, and not a single fallen leaf stayed on her walkway longer than an hour. Now, the corners of her yard had grown wild with creeping ivy, and the grass along the edges was starting to curl over the pavement. Her silence was almost louder than her previous presence. It was like watching the slow unraveling of a stage set after the play had ended. The props still in place, but the actor gone, the illusion broken. I heard from Nolan again that afternoon. He called with an update on the investigation, though he made it clear he could not share many details. What he did say was enough. The two men who had impersonated law enforcement were facing formal charges related to unlawful impersonation and trespassing. The hired security contractor they claimed to work for had no legal standing and was not registered with any local or state oversight board. The paper trail led back to a third-party LLC that appeared to be newly formed, without a physical office, and with Karen's signature on the contract. That signature was now part of the official case file. Nolan told me the district attorney's office had been notified, and that Karen would likely be called in for questioning. Whether or not it led to a formal indictment was uncertain. These cases were not always straightforward. There were legal lines that had to be proven crossed, and people like Karen often knew how to dance just shy of them. Still, the fact that her involvement had moved from rumor to documentation meant the situation had grown teeth. That weekend, the Oversight Committee held its first informal gathering on the green lawn in front of the clubhouse. It was not an official meeting, just a chance for residents to speak openly about their concerns and share their stories. I went, not because I had anything new to report, but because I felt like it was important to be there. It felt like standing at the beginning of something better, something reclaimed. About 20 people showed up, most of them carrying folded lawn chairs or blankets. Someone brought lemonade. A few kids played soccer in the background. It would have looked like a block party, if not for the small whiteboard propped up near the hedge with the words "Community Voices" written in black marker. One by one, people spoke. Some just shared small frustrations. Others admitted they had paid fines they did not think were fair, but had been too afraid to ask questions. One older woman said she had been made to remove her flower boxes because the color clashed with the community palette. Another said she had been denied a minor home renovation because her application was not submitted in duplicate, even though she later found out that rule did not exist. Each story was a thread. Alone they might have been dismissed as overreactions or isolated misunderstandings, but together they wove a very clear pattern. Karen had not been enforcing community values. She had been inventing them. Her rules were flexible only when they served her interests, and absolute when they were used to punish anyone she viewed as a threat. During a pause in the discussion, a man I had never spoken to before walked up to me and shook my hand. He said he had been living in the neighborhood for 9 years and had always felt like something was off, but never had the energy or courage to challenge it. He thanked me, not with some grand speech or public announcement, just a simple look that said more than words ever could. Others followed. Quiet nods, soft thanks, a few pats on the back. It was not hero worship. It was relief. The kind that comes from knowing someone finally said what everyone else was thinking. Karen was not present at the gathering. Her absence spoke volumes. A week ago, she would have been at the center of any community event, clipboard in hand, controlling the schedule and approving the location of every chair and cooler. Now she was nowhere to be seen. Someone mentioned that she had been spotted at the town hall earlier that day, but no one knew why. Another said she had been making calls to board members trying to delay the upcoming vote, citing procedural flaws. No one seemed interested in helping her anymore. The following Monday, a new message appeared on the HOA bulletin board and in everyone's mailbox. It was from the Interim Oversight Committee, informing residents that the emergency vote on leadership positions would proceed as scheduled. The notice included a formal review of recent events and confirmed that Karen had acted outside the bounds of her authority by hiring a security service without a vote and by failing to disclose the nature of their contract. The letter was respectful but firm. It did not sensationalize or exaggerate. It simply laid out the facts that could no longer be ignored. Later that day, as I was pulling weeds from the front flower bed, Karen finally emerged. She walked to her mailbox slowly, eyes hidden behind large sunglasses, shoulders slightly hunched. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired. There was a hesitation in her steps, the kind that suggested she knew people were watching but did not want to acknowledge them. I made eye contact, not to provoke her, but because I wanted her to see that I was not afraid. She did not speak. She just took her mail and returned inside without a word. In the days leading up to the vote, the neighborhood grew more vocal. Discussions sprang up in driveways, near mailboxes, and over backyard fences. People were talking again. There were still those who kept their heads down, uncertain or unwilling to take a side, but they were no longer the majority. The silence that had once blanketed the community like a fog was lifting. It did not mean everyone agreed or that everything was suddenly perfect, but it meant they were paying attention now. They were involved. That mattered more than anything else. I spent one of those evenings sitting on my porch with a cold drink, watching the sun fall behind the treetops. It had been months since I moved in, and only now did it feel like I truly lived there. The house was no longer a place to retreat from Karen. It was just home. A dog barked in the distance. Sprinklers hissed in unison across the lawn. Someone laughed from the far side of the street. It was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet Karen had forced. This was different. This was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the dust settles and the air smells clean, and for the first time in a long time, everyone breathes freely. The evening of the emergency vote arrived under a grey sky that threatened rain, but held back just enough to keep the streets dry. The weather fit the mood. Not hostile, not celebratory, just heavy with expectation. People started arriving at the community clubhouse well before the scheduled time. Some came with folded umbrellas tucked under their arms just in case. Others carried lawn chairs or clipboards. A few came alone, walking slowly as if unsure what they would find once they stepped through the doors. I showed up about 10 minutes early, dressed casually, not trying to make a statement. I had no intention of speaking unless asked. This wasn't about me. The moment belonged to everyone who had felt silenced, manipulated, or intimidated. I took a seat near the middle of the room, close enough to hear clearly but far enough back that I could watch the expressions of the board and the residents at the same time. The room filled up quickly. Chairs scraped across the tile floor as neighbors found places to sit or stood along the walls. There were more people than I had expected. A few younger couples I had never seen before arrived with small children and snacks, clearly prepared for a long meeting. Some of the older residents sat in small clusters, whispering back and forth and eyeing the front of the room where the board sat behind a folding table. Karen was there, seated at the far left, her face expressionless. She wore a pale blue blouse and her signature hairstyle, perfectly in place as always, though her posture lacked its usual certainty. Next to her sat the two remaining board members, both of whom looked tired but focused. Neither one smiled. Neither one spoke. They held their folders in their laps and waited while the crowd settled. A few minutes past the hour, one of them, a man named Joel who had lived in the neighborhood for almost 20 years, stood and addressed the room. He began with a summary of the night's purpose. The agenda was simple. First, a review of the events that had led to the emergency vote. Then, an opportunity for residents to voice concerns or support for changes in leadership. Finally, a private ballot to determine whether the current president of the HOA would be removed from her position. Joel's tone was measured and calm. He did not point fingers or make accusations. He simply stated the facts. Karen sat still through all of it. She kept her eyes fixed forward, never glancing at the crowd, never reacting to the mention of impersonation charges or the unauthorized hiring of outside contractors. Her hands remained folded on the table, the same way she had sat in every previous meeting, projecting control. But the energy in the room had shifted. This time, the authority in her posture did not land. It felt like a habit she hadn't yet realized no longer worked. When Joel finished the summary, he opened the floor to comments. At first, no one moved. The silence stretched, not out of fear but out of uncertainty. Then, one of the older residents, a retired teacher named Gloria, stood up and cleared her throat. She spoke softly, saying she had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and had served on an HOA board before moving here. She said she believed in rules, in order, and in community standards. But what she did not believe in was fear, and that was what she had felt for too long. Fear of stepping out of line, fear of decorating her home the way she wanted, fear of walking her dog past certain houses at certain times. Her voice cracked as she said it, and the room was completely silent. Then another woman stood, then a man, and another. They each spoke, not with anger but with quiet frustration. Some admitted they had voted for Karen in past elections because they believed she kept the community organized. Others said they had avoided previous meetings because they felt they had no voice. But all of them, every single one, said the same thing in different words. They wanted change. They wanted accountability. They wanted their neighborhood back. Karen finally spoke when the last comment finished. She stood slowly, unfolding herself with deliberate calm. Her voice, when it came, was steady and practiced. She thanked everyone for their honesty, said she had always tried to serve the community to the best of her ability, and admitted that perhaps she had made some errors in judgment. She did not apologize. Instead, she pivoted. She warned of the dangers of disorder, of what could happen if leadership became weak, if standards were abandoned. She said people did not always understand the burden of keeping a community intact, that the work of maintaining order was often thankless and misinterpreted. She went on for several minutes, touching on every point but never addressing the impersonation incident directly. She claimed she had acted with the board's knowledge, though Joel shifted uncomfortably at that statement. She insisted that everything done was within the scope of her role as president and concluded by asking the community to consider what kind of leadership they truly wanted. She sat down without looking at anyone. The vote proceeded with little ceremony. Ballots were passed out row by row. People marked them in silence and returned them to a large box placed at the front. There were no speeches, no campaign moments, no applause, just the quiet rustle of paper and the occasional cough or shuffle of feet. The collection took less than 10 minutes. While the ballots were being counted by 3 volunteers from the oversight committee, the room buzzed with low murmurs. When the results were read aloud, the message was unmistakable. By a large margin, the community had voted to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. She did not react. She did not argue or protest. She simply gathered her folder, stood up, and walked out of the room. The doors opened and closed behind her without a word. No one cheered. No one clapped. The moment felt too significant for that. It was not a victory in the usual sense. It was more like the end of a long drought, a quiet shift in weather. People sat in stunned silence for a few moments, and then conversations began to pick up again, this time lighter, more open. Joel remained to oversee the final part of the meeting, discussing temporary leadership arrangements and how the board would be restructured. Volunteers signed up to assist. Committees were proposed. Neighbors who had not spoken to one another in years exchanged phone numbers and suggestions for improvement. As the room slowly emptied, I lingered near the back, watching as people filtered out into the night. Some carried their chairs, some walked in pairs. The rain never came. The clouds had drifted off while we were inside. A few stars had broken through. Outside the clubhouse, Michelle caught up to me. She smiled, not big, but real. She said we should organize a neighborhood BBQ sometime soon, maybe next month, maybe sooner. I told her I liked the idea. When I walked home that night, I passed Karen's house. The porch light was off, the windows dark. Her yard was quiet, the hedges still overgrown. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. She had built her kingdom on silence and fear. And now, with one vote, The silence was gone. The neighborhood had not just removed its president, it had reclaimed its voice. The following week was unlike anything I had seen since the day I moved into the neighborhood. There was an energy running through the streets that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. For the first time in months, people looked each other in the eyes as they passed. There was no sense of tension behind the waves and smiles. The curtain of mistrust that had blanketed the community had been pulled back, and underneath it was something human again. It started with small things. Someone chalked a giant sun and a trail of flowers on the sidewalk in front of their house. Not one person objected. In fact, the next day, 2 more houses had chalk drawings of their own. Kids who had been told to keep quiet near Karen's property were now running across lawns with water balloons and scooters. The sound of laughter echoed off garage doors. Someone even placed a note near one of the chalk drawings that said simply, "Keep going." One morning, I saw a group of neighbors gathered in front of the mailbox cluster, talking over coffee. They stayed there for more than an hour. Some brought folding chairs. It became a kind of impromptu ritual. A few days later, someone brought donuts. On Friday, a speaker appeared, playing music at a modest volume. No one called to complain. The most noticeable change, though, was the sense of relief. It showed up in the way people stepped onto their porches or opened their garage doors without a quick glance over their shoulder. It lived in the small details, like seasonal wreaths on doors that had once been forbidden, or backyard parties that extended a little beyond dusk without fear of citation. The rules had not been erased, but their shadow had shrunk. It was as though the neighborhood had collectively remembered that the point of living there was to enjoy life, not to survive scrutiny. The temporary board, now led by Joel and 2 newly appointed residents, moved quickly to undo some of the more restrictive measures Karen had introduced during her reign. They reinstated the community suggestion box and hosted a feedback meeting where residents could voice which rules felt necessary and which felt oppressive. One by one, items were reviewed. The regulation against holiday decorations before December was scrapped. The mandatory mailbox color was expanded from a single shade to a palette of neutrals. Restrictions on porch furniture were loosened. The requirement for duplicate permit forms for minor renovations was eliminated entirely. Not every change happened overnight. There were still disagreements. Some people liked the structure Karen had brought, at least in theory. They worried that without strict rules, the neighborhood would decline in value or aesthetic appeal. But those conversations were no longer hushed or controlled. They took place in the open, in meetings, in yards, in texts and emails. And when the majority leaned toward common sense over cosmetic perfection, that decision was respected. The fear was gone, and in its absence, people rediscovered the ability to compromise. Karen herself did not reappear in any public meetings. Her house remained quiet. A few times I saw her walking out to her car, but she never looked around the way she once had. Her body language had shifted completely. The iron, straight posture was gone. The way she used to move like she was conducting a one-woman parade had vanished. Now she walked quickly, head down, car keys tight in her hand. Rumor spread that she had listed her home for sale. One of the realtors in the neighborhood, who had previously been tight-lipped about her dealings with Karen, confirmed it off the record. No official sign appeared on the lawn, but the listing went up online, hidden behind a nondescript agency profile. She was planning her exit quietly, the same way she had slipped out of the last board meeting. There was no farewell message, no apology, just silence, once again. But this silence did not feel the same. It was not the suffocating quiet of unchecked power. It was the silence of retreat. The night I learned she had listed her home, I sat outside on the back deck and watched the woods behind the property. Fireflies blinked in and out along the tree line, and the faint hum of cicadas wrapped the house in a soft, steady sound. I thought about the moment I first toured the house, before I ever knew about the HOA or Karen or the twisted control that had wrapped around the community. Back then, I had stood in that same spot and imagined peace. I had pictured evenings like this, simple and still, with nothing between me and the quiet but the wind and the trees. That vision had nearly been lost. It had almost been buried under paperwork and citations, under threats and fear. But it had survived, and now, finally, it felt real again. I started making changes of my own. I painted the shutters a color I actually liked, one that had been rejected under the previous standards. The new board approved it without hesitation. I planted flowers along the fence line and added a bird bath to the front garden. No one questioned it. In fact, one neighbor stopped to compliment the new color and said she might do something similar. Then came the invitation. A printed flyer slipped under every door and posted at the mailbox cluster. It was from Michelle and a few others. They were organizing a community barbecue to celebrate the new beginning. No formal agenda, no speeches, just food, games, and a sense of shared space. The note was signed with a phrase that brought a smile to my face. It said, "For once, let's gather for fun, not fines." The barbecue took place the following weekend, and it was everything the neighborhood had needed. Grills were rolled out onto driveways. Folding tables sagged under the weight of casseroles and pasta salads. Kids darted between lawn chairs with painted faces and juice boxes in hand. Someone brought a projector and set it up for an outdoor movie once the sun went down. Blankets covered the grass. Laughter rolled across the yards like a tide. At one point, Joel stood up and clinked a glass for attention. People quieted. He thanked everyone for coming, for speaking up, for being brave enough to stand together. He said something that stuck with me. He said, "We didn't just take back our neighborhood. We remembered it belongs to us in the first place." After that, the music came back on, and the celebration rolled forward. I walked home later than I had in a long time, passing house after house with porch lights glowing and windows cracked open to let in the cool night air. I passed Karen's house without even looking over. I no longer needed to. Whatever hold she had once had over the place had faded into memory. And in its place was something stronger, not just freedom, but community, not just peace, but presence. That night, I slept with the windows open. No alarms, no recordings running, no sense of watching my back, just air and quiet, and the distant sound of someone laughing 3 houses away. It finally felt like home. Sometimes, change announces itself with sirens and spotlights. Other times, it settles in like mist, barely noticed until you realize the air feels different. In the days and weeks after the neighborhood barbecue, I found myself stepping into the life I had originally imagined when I bought the house. Not a perfect life, not without its daily frustrations or minor headaches, but a life that felt like mine. It was no longer defined by watching my steps, dodging unwritten rules, or anticipating the next absurd notice taped to my door. It was just life. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The mornings felt fresh again. I would make coffee and sit on the porch while the neighborhood slowly came to life. Sprinklers popped on in bursts across trimmed lawns. Dogs barked in the distance as owners began their walks. Children played without the undercurrent of nervous shushing. The silence that once weighed heavily on everything had been replaced by something else. Movement, laughter, conversation. I even got into the habit of chatting with my neighbors more. Mr. Rivera, who used to keep to himself behind drawn curtains, now waved every morning as he swept his porch. Sometimes he stopped to tell a story about how the neighborhood used to be before things took a turn. Michelle and her husband invited me over for dinner one night, just a casual meal with no agenda beyond enjoying company. Another neighbor I barely knew until recently asked if I would help him build a raised garden bed. We ended up talking for hours while cutting wood and hauling soil. The fence lines between houses did not vanish, but they softened. People leaned over them more, asked for help more, offered it freely. The shift was not dramatic, but it was meaningful. There was a shared sense of ownership that did not revolve around enforcement or citations. It came from something deeper, something earned. It came from standing together when it would have been easier to stay silent. As for Karen, she moved out quietly. A black SUV with a trailer showed up one morning and idled outside her house for hours, while a pair of movers hauled boxes into the back. She did not say goodbye. No letter was sent to the board. No apology was written. One day she lived across the street. The next, she did not. The house stayed empty for a few weeks. Then a new couple moved in, eager and bright-eyed, unaware of the history buried just beneath the driveway. I smiled when they waved to me on their first day. I waved back without hesitation. With Karen gone, the board moved forward on reforming the HOA's guidelines. A community-wide vote was held to confirm the new leadership, and Joel was officially installed as the new president. He brought in a local attorney to help review the existing regulations and strip out anything that was vague or excessive. The language became clearer, the consequences fairer. No one wanted anarchy. People still wanted clean streets and safe sidewalks. They just wanted those things without being watched like children in a classroom. They wanted standards built on consensus, not fear. One Saturday afternoon, as I worked on repainting the garden fence, a group of kids rode past on their bikes. One of them had a police cruiser sticker stuck to the back of his helmet, and it made me laugh out loud. It reminded me of that night Karen had sent her fake officers to my gate. That surreal moment when two men dressed in official-looking gear had tried to play a role and failed spectacularly. It felt like it had happened years ago, not months, but I had not forgotten it. I did not want to. I had taken that same cruiser sticker and stuck it on my mailbox, not out of spite, but out of humor. A small reminder of how far things had come. Some neighbors chuckled when they saw it. Others gave me a thumbs up. It was not just a joke. It was a symbol. It was proof that standing up to someone who abused their power had not only worked, but had brought people together. That experience taught me something I had not expected. Most people are not looking for control. They are looking for peace. But when one person decides that power belongs to them alone, it only takes one other person to say no for everything to start shifting. I had not set out to be that person. I had just wanted to move into a nice house on a quiet street. But when Karen crossed the line, and when she stood on my doorstep with manufactured authority, I saw a choice. Accept the fear or confront it. I confronted it. Not alone. Never alone. Nolan was there. My neighbors were there. Even the ones who stayed quiet at first found their voice when they saw the truth. That matters more than I can put into words. Sometimes I still walk the trail that winds through the backwoods, the one Karen once used to peer into my yard. It is different now. The trees are the same, the path is the same, but it does not feel like an intrusion anymore. It feels like part of home. I walk it to clear my head, to remind myself how much of this started with a simple boundary. Not just a physical one, but a personal one. A refusal to let someone bully me into submission. A decision to meet intimidation with calm resistance. And if there is any lesson in all of this, any piece of advice I would offer to someone stepping into a neighborhood with an overzealous HOA or a board member who confuses authority with superiority, it would be this. Learn the rules, but do not be afraid of them. Understand your rights. Speak them clearly. Document everything. Trust that one voice, when joined by others, becomes something powerful. Something that cannot be ignored. Also, get to know your neighbors. Say hello. Offer a hand. Bake something once in a while if that is your thing. The strength of a community does not come from rules or citations. It comes from people showing up for one another. It comes from shared space, mutual respect, and the occasional laugh at a mailbox decorated with a police sticker. The HOA still exists, but now it works. It listens. It serves. That is all it was ever supposed to do. And I live here now. Not hiding, not resisting, just living. Which is more than I ever expected to say. But I am glad I can.